Do you see the record symbol, Phyllis?
Yes.
Okay, excellent.
Are you beeping?
When you're healed, I'm healed. When you're whole, I'm whole. When you're safe, I'm safe. When you're free, I'm free. When you can breathe, I can breathe. When you win, I win. When you're fed, I'm fed. We have everything to gain. When you're healed, I'm healed. When you're whole, I'm whole. When you're safe, I'm safe. When you're free, I'm free. When you can breathe, I can breathe. When you win, I win. When you feel respect, I feel respect. We have everything to gain. When you're healed, I'm healed. When you're whole, I'm whole. When you're safe, I'm safe. When you're free, I'm free. When you can breathe, I can breathe. When you win, I win. When you're home, I'm home. We have everything to gain. When you're healed, I'm healed. When you're whole, I'm whole. When you're safe, I'm safe. When you're free, I'm free. When you can breathe, I can breathe. When you win, I win. When you're fed, I'm fed. We have everything to gain. When you're healed, I'm healed. When you're whole, I'm whole. When you're safe, I'm safe. When you're free, I'm free. When you can breathe, I can breathe. When you win, I win. When you feel respect, I feel respect. We have everything to gain. When you're healed, I'm healed. When you're whole, I'm whole. When you're safe, I'm safe. When you're free, I'm free. When you can breathe, I can breathe. When you win, I win. When you're home, I'm home. We have everything to gain.
Good afternoon. My name is Phyllis Demko. I'm a member of the State Board of the League of Women Voters of North Carolina. Welcome, everyone. Just a few technical things before we get started. First of all, we would appreciate your leaving your system on mute unless you are speaking. We would ask you to please rename yourself. And in order to do that, you go to your image and you'll see 3 dots at the top right. Hover over those 3 dots, hover over your picture and then press the square in which the three dots are, and you will see an opportunity to change your name so that you have not only your name, but your local league or your affiliation if you are a member of a league. And welcome to all of you who are both members and not members yet of the League of Women Voters of North Carolina. We will be using the chat because we have a lot of people registered, and it just makes it more efficient if we do that. So if you have questions or comments for the speaker or for anything else, if you will place that in the chat. If you would, please put a Q in front of any question and a C in front of any comment to distinguish it. We will try to get to all of the questions and as many of the comments as we can. You will notice that we have closed captions on. We are an inclusive community, and if you find the closed captions to be irritating or distracting, you can go to down at the bottom of your screen, you will see something that says CC, and press that and then hide. And that way you can get rid of your closed captions. Just checking to make sure there's nothing else. Oh, you might want to adjust your view at this point while folks are entering still. Those beeps are kind of distracting, so we'll give you a little bit of time to adjust your view, whether you want a speaker or a gallery view. Just so you know, our speaker, our main speaker, Tema Okun, will not be using PowerPoint slides. If that makes any difference to you for the way you want to view the next part of the program. And now I ask our State League President, Joe Nicholas, to say a few words. Joe?
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see this number coming and learning about some things that we need to learn together. This is our very first of maybe many diversity, equity, and inclusion webinars. We're at a turning point in our lives that we must make sure everyone is included in the process, and particularly the political environment. We thank you for attending and hope that you will be inspired to help us on our journey. I ask that you too, if you're interested in this, to support our work in the future, we hope maybe you might make a little gift of whatever size. We will be placing in the chat the website link where you can make a donation today or any other time that you may have an opportunity. You may specify that you want your gift to be used for the League's DEI program. And especially for those of you who are unfamiliar with the League of Women Voters of North Carolina, you'll find a link for joining this fantastic group and a link for learning about other events sponsored by the League of Women Voters of North Carolina. I don't want to hold you back now. I want us to go ahead and learn together. And thank you, Phyllis, for organizing this. Back to you.
Thank you, Joe. We will be putting those links to how you can help the League of Women Voters or join us in the chat very shortly. Now I'd like to introduce to you our main speaker, Dr. Tema Okun. Dr. Okun has spent more than 30 years working with and for organizations, schools, and community-based institutions as a trainer, facilitator, and coach, focused on issues of racial justice and equity. She currently co-leads the Teaching for Equity Fellows at Duke University, which works with faculty seeking to develop stronger skills in teaching about race and racism and in working across lines of race, class, and gender. She is also part of the Teach Equity Now program based at the Pauli Murray Center in Durham. Tema is the author of the award-winning The Emperor Has No Clothes, teaching about race and racism to people who don't want to know, and the widely used article, White Supremacy Culture. A revision of that article on white supremacy will be the centerpiece of a new website Tema is launching soon, on which she will make available a wealth of resources to help us all deal with racism in our culture. So I remind you, if you have questions for Tema, go ahead and use the chat to indicate what you would like for her to respond to. Tema, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. And I hope you will use the chat. Hold on. Okay, sorry, trying to organize my notes here. I hope you will use the chat because I do like to know if you have questions as I go or comments or things that I'm saying that either if you agree with them or you understand them or you want to salute them, you can say that. If you have a question or you go, I don't know about that, I'm anxious to know how you're thinking and feeling about what I have to say. And I think I was invited here to talk about the stake that the League has in racial equity and justice. And, you know, I am a voter, I am a woman voter, I'm a white woman voter. And so as a white woman voter, I think I have a huge stake in racial equity. I think all of us who are voters who care about women have a huge stake in racial equity. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to start by defining some terms, and I plan to talk between 15 and 20 minutes and then either answer questions along the way or take questions at the end. So that's kind of and what I'm going to do is sort of start by defining some terms so that we're all on the same page, and then get into some of what I think the stake is. So I'm going to start first by saying something that most of you, if not all of you, already know, which is that race is not biologically real. Race is a social and political construct, meaning that it was created as an idea. It was constructed over time, initially as a pseudoscientific justification for this idea as a way to categorize and value or devalue people coming out of Europe. But the idea was really refined here in the US, where this notion of a white race was deeply solidified. So race and whiteness were constructed here and continued to be constructed here. And I would say that the driving force between this idea of race and whiteness is power and profit for the few at the expense of the many. So I'm just going to say that again, that the construction of this idea of race, and I'm going to say more about this in a minute. And I'm wondering, Phyllis, if you wouldn't mind muting yourself, because is that where the dings are coming from? It's a little bit distracting. And if it's not possible, that's okay too. So I want to just say again that this notion that this idea of race as a hierarchy, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, this idea that there's a white race, those ideas were constructed as a way to divide and conquer people in the interests of a few people's power and a few people's profit. So biologically, we are all 97% genetically the same, and the genetic differences that we do experience are not actually have anything to do with race. They have more to do with geography and where we came from and where our people came from. I'm going to give you a historical example of this idea of race and whiteness as a divide and conquer strategy, because I really believe in the power of history to help us understand who we are and why we're in the mess we're in right now. So this is in the 1640s, there was a historical event, which I call the John Punch event. So there was a farmer named Hugh McGuinn, and this was before slavery was, enslavement was a widespread practice. And the practice was indentured servitude. So what we had people coming from Europe, from England, from France, from Holland, people coming from Europe with very different amounts of power and resources. And so you had people who came who were and identified as nationalities, not as white. They identified, I'm English, I'm French, I'm Dutch, And they came and they either, if they had power and resources, they became landowners. And if they didn't, they were often consigned to indentured servitude. And sometimes people in Europe were sentenced as a result of some crime, sentenced to come into indentured servitude here in the US. And so this farmer, Hugh McGuinn, was a farmer who used indentured servants, and he had at least three. One was a Scotchman, one was a Dutchman, and one was the word that was used at the time, a Negro, a man of African descent named John Punch. And the name of the James Gregory and Victor, I don't remember Victor's last name, were the Scotchman and the Dutchman. And the three of them were indentured servants, and they all ran away together to Maryland to try to achieve freedom, because indentured servitude was a pretty harsh life. And people who worked as indentured servants, men and women of all different nationalities and national origins, were lived very short and punishing lives at that point. And so they ran away and they were caught. All three of them were caught, and they were brought back to Virginia, which is where a lot of our early laws, because it was the biggest colony, originated from. And the court, and they sat they were all given some number of lashes, 40 lashes, some high number of lashes, high for even that time that time. So they were all punished physically in that way. And then they were sent to court, where the Dutchman and the Scotchman were assigned some short period of extended servitude, after which point they would be free. And John Punch was sentenced to lifetime enslavement to Hugh McGuinn or any of his assigns, the people who came after him. And this was the first case where, so the word white wasn't even in use yet, but this is the first case where the law started to embed this notion of white privilege, that if you have a nationality that is European, and that is soon going to be associated with this word called white, then you get a lighter sentence. If you are someone who was brought here from Africa, you're going to get a sentence of enslavement. And that's happening on land that was taken from indigenous people, right? So I always like to think, I use this case because I like us to think about what was going on in the courtroom on that day for those three people, for those three men. What was happening in the minds and hearts of the Dutchman and the Scotchman as they received lighter sentences and saw their friend, because they ran away together, John Punch, get this lifetime enslavement sentence. And what was happening for John Punch as he experienced the sentence of lifetime enslavement, while he saw his two friends get a much lighter sentence. And we start to see this embedding into the law of white supremacy and racism, even before the word white is invented. And within the next 40 or 50 years, the Virginia House of Burgesses will start using the word white as an organizing term to bring people from different European nationalities together into one group, because they had to. Landowners, European landowners were greatly outnumbered at this point by indigenous people and by people they were bringing over from Africa to do enslaved labor. And so they couldn't have people identifying from Europe, identifying based on nationality, because if they did that, they would not be a consolidated group in a size big enough to take on the threat of these bigger numbers of indigenous and African descent, people of African descent. And so they created this category called white, and they started slowly but surely giving material benefits to people belonging to the white group. And one of the first material benefits that people belonging to the white group got, men in particular, as they ended their indentured servitude, was to get jobs on the slave patrol, to get jobs as foremen on plantations, so to start policing. So one of the ways that people in the white group and families in the white group could get ahead was to start policing the bodies of Black and brown people in this country. And so you can read some of the early laws about what happened when white indentured servants came to the end of their indentured servitude time. They would get land, they would get corn, they would get guns, they would get a little bit of money. So you start to see material benefits in terms of financial material benefits, legal material benefits, and almost more important, if not more important, psychic benefits. Because the way that whiteness operated and the way that whiteness was able to succeed was to organize people from Europe into this group called white, which was established as a group that had more value. So whiteness starts to become associated with value, with being deserving. You're deserving of these material benefits. Those of us in the white group were deserving. Those of us in the white group are more human, while those in the Black group are inhuman. Those in the indigenous group are savage. White supremacy starts to be not just a construct that gives people material benefits, but it starts to create this whole psychic understanding of what it means, of what a racial category means. And the reason that's important is because race is not just a construct, it's a construct that's set up as a hierarchy. And in this hierarchy, white is at the very top and Black is at the very bottom. So I'm not talking about what's real, because race is not real. I'm talking about the reality of the construct and how the power elite created this construct that put white at the top and Black at the bottom. And so when you hear the phrase anti-Black racism, that's what that means, which is that the race was constructed with Black at the very bottom. And other groups coming from Central and South America, coming from India, coming from Arab countries, coming from Japan, coming from China, would move up and down between white and Black, but the line was always under white, depending on what was happening at any given time in history. So for example, before 9/11, people of Arab descent in this country were very close to white. Now, after 9/11, the construct says that to be Arab is to be Muslim, is to be terrorist. And that's the way that when we talk about, and of course that's not true, none of that's true. And I want to be really clear, none of that's true. I'm talking about the power of the construct and the way the construct works in our minds to assign value to people, to some people, to people in the white group, while stripping value and assigning all kinds of criminal, danger, threat values to people who do not belong to Black and brown people. So race becomes a hierarchy of value that assigns benefits, material and psychic benefits, to people in the white group, while consigning people of African descent, other people in communities of color, to less or no value. And in some ways trying to exterminate indigenous people altogether, to act as if indigenous people don't even exist, while of course they thrive and resist at all times and have from the beginning of our history. So that's when we're talking about white supremacy and we're talking about racism, that's what we're talking about. We're all navigating this construct. This construct is the water that we swim in this country, and none of us is free of it, none of us. And part of the way that it works is to make itself invisible, particularly to those of us in the white group. And so one of the ways that those of us in the white group are encouraged to act is to say, well, if I don't wake up in the morning with racist intent, then racism isn't happening. Because we are not taught to see how this construct is influencing every aspect of our lives. And that being born white informs our reality just as much as being born Black or brown informs the realities of people who are born Black and brown, right? So none of us, we're all swimming in this water. We're all swimming in this water that assigns more value to those of us who are white and less value to people of color, people in communities of color. We're all having to navigate that in some way or other. And when we talk about white supremacy, we're talking about institutions. So the ways in which every institution in this country, if we know our history, participated in this construct and participates still through its policy, through policies and procedures, through practices, institutional practices. So if we look at any institution, if we look at education or prisons or government, we'll see very entrenched disparities based on race. When we're talking about white supremacy, we're talking about culture, which is when I'm talking about the psychic impact of white supremacy, we're talking about the way the culture reinforces this idea that things that attach to whiteness are valuable, are normal. One of the ways that we understand how devious white supremacy is that to be white is both normal and better, which is, kind of an expression of the deviousness of white supremacy. So it's got this white supremacy culture has the psychic aspect this way. It spreads values and beliefs about who's normal and who's not, about who fits standards and who doesn't. It's personal, so it impacts our personal and interpersonal relationships. It impacts the relationships that we have with ourselves. Because I'm going to contend that white supremacy as a construct, institutional, cultural, personal, is toxic to all of us. It's not toxic to all of us in the same way, but it is not good for any of us. There is no way that it's good for me as a white person who's been conditioned to believe that I'm both normal and better, that helps me in any way. It might confuse me into thinking that it helps me, but it does not help. It separates me from myself to believe that I'm better than other people simply because I'm white, even if I don't acknowledge to myself that I believe that, because I understand somewhere that to do that would mean that I'm racist, and I can't possibly admit that I'm racist, because I do know that it's not a good thing to be racist. So maybe what I'll do instead is deny that I'm impacted by racism at all and say, well, I'm not racist, I don't have those thoughts, which just makes it worse, because I'm invested in this denial of my own conditioning, which means I don't see it, and I spend all of my energy trying to pretend that it's not there. And I say this, I'm 69 years old, so I've been in this world a long time, and I was really, really lucky because I grew up in a family in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. My father was a professor there. My mother taught on and off in the schools, and I grew up during the time when Chapel Hill High when the schools were being desegregated. And so those of you, I'm sure there's some of you here from Chapel Hill, what happened in Chapel Hill was they took the white high school, Chapel Hill High, and the black high school, Lincoln High, and they merged them into one school called Chapel Hill High on the edge, what was the very edge of town, right? So just thinking about that. So they took the Chapel Hill High, the white school, Lincoln High, they merged them, but they kept the name of the white school. In fact, they kept the identity of the white school altogether. And I went back, this is maybe 15 years ago, and started looking at the yearbooks. You might not know that there were any black students at that school until you got to the individual pictures at the back. Because what they did in Chapel Hill, which is what they did across the South during desegregation, when schools did desegregate, was they fired all the black teachers and most of the black administrators, kept all the white teachers, kept all the white administrators, and hired a lot of uncredentialed white teachers because they believed the school boards, the people who were in control, the white people who were in control of education, they believed and had internalized the belief that black teachers couldn't possibly teach white students, while white teachers could teach anybody. And so what I did was I walked into a high school where some of my classes were integrated, some of my classes had black students in them. And at that time, Chapel Hill was mostly either black or white. There were not a lot of Latinx people there or people of Asian descent, although there were a few. But I would walk into school, all of my teachers were white. My experience as a white high school student basically didn't change very much at all. While all the students who came from Lincoln High, their experience was completely shattered, literally shattered. They had run their own newspaper, they had run their own proms, they had a football team at Lincoln High that had a state record, an undefeated state record of many years. And a black student in an oral history talked about walking down the hall and literally seeing the trophies from Lincoln High in the trash, like literally in the trash. And Mr. McDougall, the principal at Lincoln High, became the vice principal. That's when you look at McDougall Elementary is named for, I think, for him and his wife, who are both educators. But it was, so their experience was completely wrenched, and they were in classrooms where at best, white teachers who were completely unprepared and had no experience teaching students of color, at best saw them as behind, and at worst saw them as deficient. So they went from being the geniuses that they were in Lincoln High, perceived by the teachers as such, perceived as by their community as such, into this world where they were all of a sudden deficient. And it was a problem. I mean, it was a huge problem. And one of the ways that that problem showed itself was that Black students would demonstrate and do sit-ins. And we also formed, white and Black students together formed something called the Race Council. And we met one night in my house. And we were downstairs talking, and this Black teen, my age, was saying to me, "You're racist." I'm going, "No, I'm not." He's going, "Yes, you are." I'm going, "No, you're not." "Yes, you are." "No, I'm not." And that was our conversation. And I said, "Okay, hold on, stop. I have to go upstairs and get refreshments." And this was the gift. This is why I say I was lucky, because my mother turned to me, this woman who was raised in a very poor community in Texas. She turned to me and she said, "Get a grip. You're a white girl growing up in a racist country. You're racist, deal with it." And so I learned very early to stop going, "No, no, no, no," and to start going, "Oh, let me consider how I am conditioned into this thing called racism. And let me start dealing with it now," at 16. So that was such a gift. But the way that white supremacy works for most of us in the white group is to teach us early, either to be really proud of being racist, which we see in the Proud Boys and white nationalism, or to know that there's something wrong with being racist, so to claim that we couldn't possibly be that, and to deny the way that white supremacy and racism is operating on the institutional level and the cultural level every day, every day. So for me to internalize, and that we're internalizing these messages all the time about who we are and our own, those of us who are white, our own validity, our own normalness, our own superiority, even though those messages that can be overt and they can be subtle, and they're there in a constant way. There's a very powerful interview that Toni Morrison gave to Charlie Rose, which you can find on YouTube. This was before, when Charlie Rose was still on NPR, before he was Me Too'd off. And she talks about how growing up, she was a little older than I am, growing up in the South as a young Black girl, and knowing very early, she said, and I'm not going to speak as eloquently as she does, but she says, I knew very early that that I and my community had the moral imperative. I knew very early that we were the ones on the moral high ground, because I saw that if what it takes for you to stand tall is to put your knee on my neck, then there's something really, really wrong with you. And so when I say that white supremacy is toxic to all of us, so I'm speaking to those of us who are white now, I think that the toxicity of white supremacy to us is the way in which it encourages us on a daily basis to disconnect from our humanity in all the subtle ways that it teaches us or tells us or whispers in our ear that we are normal and we are better and we are valid and we are qualified, when we're not any more than anyone else, right? So I wrote this article that most people associate with me about white supremacy culture over 20 years ago, because I saw all the ways that white supremacy culture invites us, and not just those of us in the white group, but invites us into behaviors that don't really serve us. And that list is a list of those behaviors that serve to disconnect. So when I boil it down, when I'm talking about white supremacy culture, what I'm talking about is a culture that disconnects at every level. It disconnects white people from people of color, from Black, Indigenous, and people of color and communities of color. It can disconnect white people from other white people. It disconnects Black people from Indigenous people from other communities of color and disconnects within those communities. It disconnects me from myself. It disconnects me from God or spirit or creativity or whatever you call, sort of the genius that flows among us or the love that flows among us. Its whole purpose is to keep us disconnected and off, out of love. So, and none of us escape. We all have to navigate this in some kind of way. And although I would say I'm not to blame for the level of racism and white supremacy that I'm navigating, I'm responsible. I am responsible. All of us are responsible, Because if I don't do something about it, and this is where I get to the stake, if I don't do something about it, then I am consigned to this kind of conditioning that is no good for me. It destroys me. It destroys me. It destroys my relationships. It destroys my relationships across lines of race. It destroys my relationships with other white people. It destroys my relationships with myself. It destroys my relationship to God. And I don't require that everybody believe in God, but I do. So, or to love, if you want, if you wish. And the thing I would point out, yes, caste is, somebody's referencing caste. So caste is a much better explanation of what I'm saying than what I'm offering you. So I highly recommend that book. So what I want us to understand, so that white supremacy, it's a system, it's institutional, it's cultural, it's personal, and we know that we're swimming in it now because it's emerging forcefully into the public sphere. It's now become mainstream. It's coded. It's both coded, but it's also more and more overt. And we see one of our mainstream political parties becoming more and more overtly white supremacist, white nationalist. That white nationalism is entering into a mainstream political party. And that party has a platform of voter suppression. Several states have already outlawed critical race theory, teaching of critical race theory. We have propaganda masquerading as news in the face of very clear evidence about something about who was elected president. And so that what we tend to understand as white supremacy, which is, the Klan, people wearing white hoods, or the Proud Boys, has become sort of a mainstream ideology that's driving one of the political parties. And I would say if you're Republican, you should be deeply, deeply concerned about the direction of your party. And if you're Democrat, you should be deeply, deeply concerned about the direction of your party, because the party's neither party is standing up very forcefully to this emergence of white nationalism, which is closely tied to the destruction of democracy and the rise of autocracy. I have a friend named Scott Nagakawa who really studies these white nationalist groups, and what he says is that this kind of white nationalism and autocracy is spreading across the globe, and 67% of the world's population is now living under autocracy driven by power and profit, and autocracy based on racist and nationalist rhetoric. That is historically such a pattern. We can see it if we know our history. We see this pattern repeated over and over and over again. And it's aimed at undermining democracy, undermining democratic decision making, and stoking fear of the racialized other, who's dangerous, a threat to our way of life, whoever our is. All code words meant to keep people afraid and vulnerable to all kinds of misinformation. So I contend, and my guess is most of you too, that democracy is at great risk right now. And so the stake of the League of Women Voters, given your concern about voting, is that white supremacy and racism are being used to organize white voters, and in particular white women voters, into a racist framework that insists Black and brown people are a threat, that their right to vote is a threat, their ability to inform the hysterical narrative is a threat, that their immigrant labor is a threat. That is our national context right now. And so I think that the League you've got to be concerned about the rise of white supremacy and racism if your mission, which I understand it is to preserve and to support and to help democracy to thrive, because it's at great risk. I also want to say that inclusion here is not the goal. So, I'm not a big fan of diversity, the words diversity and inclusion, because both of them, diversity is simply, I am a fan of diversity. I mean, diversity is important in agriculture, diversity is important to our survival in general. But when it's used in a race context or a racial inclusion context, we never ask the question, who's including who into what? And when and who decides what diverse is, And are we talking about keeping everything the same, but when we look around the table, we just want to see different skin tones? Are we talking about including people into a way of doing business actually doesn't meet their needs or even meet our needs? But there's no rocking of the boat, but we want to include you. So I'm not a big fan of inclusion because I think we need wholesale transformation right now. We need to be about building really authentic relationships with each other within our own racial groups and across racial lines. We need to be about the business of deep and honest and hard. It's very hard to do this, hard loving of each other. And we don't do that in a transactional way. We don't do that in a single issue way. We don't do that in a way that assumes what we're doing is including you into our world, the white world, because the white world is very unhealthy and toxic. Because it has to be, because it's based on this idea of being better and normal, right? So what would it mean? I'm working with a group now that used to be white-led, is now led by a fierce and amazing Black woman. They are deeply committed to racial equity. And what they're doing is what I would call transformational practice. And they're centering the interests of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in their framework. So it's not about including people, it's about centering people. It's about being those people. And I do think that if you start to ask yourself the question, how would the League benefit? How would democracy benefit from this kind of relational and transformational approach to safeguarding democracy? What would we look like? What would we be like? And particularly because it's always been Black, Indigenous, and women of color, Black women, Indigenous women, and women of color who have the most to lose when democracy falters. So I think my challenge to you is to understand how white supremacy and racism are being used to distort democracy, and to ask yourselves, what does democracy require right now, given that white supremacy and racism are destroying it? And how do we, so when I talk about hard loving, I'm talking about how do we love our neighbors as ourselves. So again, I'm not asking you to be religious or to believe in God. I am saying that I am saying almost every religion has this imperative to love our neighbors as ourselves. It's very, very hard work to do that. I think about how hard it is for me to love myself. So if it's hard for me to love myself, even though I've been taught that I'm better and normal, then how hard is it going to be to actually really love my neighbor, which involves knowing when to set boundaries, when to be patient, when to push. Loving people is hard. Hating people is easy, right? So the right and the white nationalists and the Proud Boys, they're part of the reason that they're so easily successful is because it's very easy to organize people to hate and to say, well, we know that we belong because you don't. Hating is easy. Loving is hard. And I'm not talking about a Pollyanna kind of loving. I think about Dr. King talking about love without power is anemic and power without love is brutal. So, I'm talking about the kind of love that requires us to know ourselves really well and to understand that we all do better when we all do better, and that it's not about simply including people. It's about really knowing who people are and knowing that our fates are wrapped up together, and that if we're going to live in a thriving democracy, then we have to know how to love each other. So I'll leave it at that, and I will see if you have any questions.
Tema, it's Jennifer Rubin. I'm going to go through the chat a little bit because I think there's some comments in here. One, Joe Nicholas asked about your views. You alluded to this, your opinion of the struggle happening in education now regarding critical race theory.
Well, I think it's absurd. I mean, I think it's the same as the attack on voter fraud, which doesn't actually exist. I mean, I think whenever government or people in power try to prevent us from thinking, then we have a problem, right? And I think about, what I teach is critical race theory. It's a framework. It's not simply content, but it's a way of seeing the world. And what I would say is that whatever anyone teaches is a framework. Whatever anyone teaches is a way of seeing the world. And really, really good teachers help people to see that. Like, I'm supporting you to see the world, but you might see it differently. So develop your skills in how you want to see the world. What are your values? What do you care about? And as a teacher, I will also always say, I have an agenda, and I'm not pretending that I am neutral. There's no such thing as a neutral teacher. I have an agenda. And my agenda is always, how do we love each other better? How do I love myself better? How do we love each other better? That's my agenda. And I don't think we can do that if we lie to ourselves about our nation's history. And there's a lot of bravery, and there's a lot to admire in our nation's history. And there's a lot of really inhumane and horrifying justifications of the ways that we've treated people based on race and gender and all kinds of things. And if we don't face up to that, then we don't have a chance. We don't have any chance at all. If we try and pretend it didn't happen or tell stories about it. So to outlaw, in Arizona, about 10 years ago, they tried to outlaw the history of Mexico, the history of people of Mexican descent. They tried to outlaw ethnic studies, and they succeeded for a while. But you don't outlaw ideas. You don't outlaw ways of thinking. It's absurd. And it just shows that, I don't know what it shows. It shows a level of fear. It shows a level of desire to control things that can't be controlled. I find it deeply, deeply frightening.
Terry asks kind of a underlying question that I think a lot of people are grappling with. Is it ever possible for white people to not be racist, to be anti-racist? Or do we just have to live with our inherent racism? And where do we start? That might be a big question.
It is a big question, but I have an answer. I always have an answer. So be very suspicious. What I would say is that one of the things on that list that I wrote all those years ago about white supremacy culture is it loves binary thinking. It loves either or thinking. Either we're good or we're bad. Either we're right or we're wrong. Choose one. Either we're racist or we're anti-racist. Choose one. And I would say what I have learned is that I am deeply conditioned into racism, and I'm invited every day to collude with racism in some way. And I am deeply committed to being anti-racist, and that both of those things live in this body, right? And the more I understand that, and the more I understand, and I would also say that the racism that is in my body is conditioning. It's not who I am. I am essentially really good. I'm essentially fabulous, actually. I'm essentially love. But there's lots of conditioning on top of that gets in the way. Lots of punishing stories, lots of guilt and shame, lots of stuff. And white supremacy, I have such respect for white supremacy because it is so devious and adaptable, right? So I think about it as, yes, all of us in the white group are steeped in racist conditioning. And we're either in some level of denial about that, or we understand that, or trying to do something about it. And that's where becoming anti-racist comes into play. So I think it's a both and. And I'm deeply suspicious of white people who say they're not racist, because as long as you're saying no, I'm not, there's nowhere to go. It's either yes, I am, or I'm not. And that's what you're arguing about. Or if somebody claims racism, no, it's not racism. Yes, it is. No, it's not. It's like me and Sylvester. It's like there's nowhere to go with that. So those of us in the white group, always more useful to go, oh, how is that true? Let me assume that's true. How's that true? So juicy, so much to learn when we do that. Tell me more, rather than no. And again, I think that's part of the deviousness of white supremacy culture is to both teach us to be racist and then to defend against the idea that we could be racist. It's so clever.
Dale asked, how do we overcome the illusion of class when overlaid with race?
Yeah, they're completely linked. They're completely and utterly linked. And I have when this new website comes out, I'm really excited because I talk a lot more on that website about, based on not my knowledge, but knowledge that I gathered from friends and who helped me with it, but on understanding the ways in which white supremacy doesn't work the same for all white people. And if you're a poor white person or a working class white person, you don't get the same material benefits at all. And in fact, it's kind of like white supremacy is as much about capitalism as it is about whiteness and about race. And that white supremacy at some level isn't, I don't even know how to explain this, but it starts to seep out onto everyone. So I remember, I'll tell a story, which is that, I have led and co-facilitated a lot of workshops that spend 2.5 days, 3 days laying out the framework I tried to give you in like 15 minutes. And one of the things that we talk about is how institutional racism works to include, serve, finance, validate, and protect people in the white group while excluding, underserving, or not serving at all, exploiting, violating, and invalidating Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And then we talk about how that's a binary. And so, there's a lot of nuance in there. And I was leading the white affinity group, the white caucus, after we had given that explanation. And one of the white women in the group was looking at the list and looking at exclude, underserve, exploit, that referenced communities of color, and goes, well, that happens to me too. Just like that happens to me too. And she was full of resentment that her lived experience wasn't being reflected in the way that we were talking about how racism and white supremacy work. And I understand that because it's really hard not to be seen. But what I also understood in that moment, and what I said, I hope with some skill, was, yes, it does happen to you too. And the way that we know it's white supremacy is because instead of saying, oh, you know what, that happens to me too, you said, oh, that happens to me too, which is automatically pits you against people of color who are experiencing the same thing that you are, which is exactly how it works. Exactly how it works. It's like there's not enough oppression to go around, and if you don't see mine, then I'm not going to see racism. It's just this disconnecting and this pitting against happens in every angle of how white supremacy and racism work, right? And we're not encouraged to see how our experience as working or poor white people and the experience of racism that BIPOC people and communities are having might be in some ways a shared experience that unites us. I think about all the history of all the union fights in North and South Carolina and the incredible difficulty of uniting people across race because of how invested so many of us in the white group are in being just a little bit better. There's another book called Why All the Black Kids Sit Together in the Cafeteria. It's a classic. You should really read it if you haven't. It's by Beverly Daniel Tatum. And she talks about this thing called aversive racism. And she says racism is actually worse when you have two candidates who are equally qualified and one is white and one is Black, because what the hiring committee will do, and it's not always just an all-white hiring committee, they'll assume that the whiteness of the white candidate makes them just a little bit more qualified. So they can be exactly the same, but because one candidate's white, the assumption is, because it's the way that racism is embedded in our culture, the assumption is that the white person is just a little bit more qualified. And she calls that aversive racism. So, this is how it works. And those of us who are white, we don't even see it. We also think, oh, we are a little bit more qualified. And I can't tell you, teaching at Duke, how often we hear in our cohorts from particularly Black faculty, because we're working with faculty, who have to navigate every day white colleagues who think that they're not as qualified because they're Black. Or students who say that their fellow students are accusing them of getting into Duke unfairly because they got an advantage because they're Black and they're not really qualified to be at Duke. And they have to navigate that all the time. And when we talk about microaggressions and sort of the grinding down of people's experience. It's completely enraging and heartbreaking both.
There are great comments in the chat if you have a chance to look at them, Tema, because people are raving about this framework and the way that you have set this up for people to think about and how useful that is. So that's, I think, lots of positive comments in the chat. So I'll just, one last question for you. And this is a tough choice because there's several questions in there, but how did your mother reach her viewpoint?
Oh, I do want to go back and say one thing. So I want to be really clear. I'm not saying that poor and working class white people are more racist than those of us who are upper class and educated, because it's not the case. And in fact, a lot of the most right-wing, most racist legislators are in office because educated white women voted for them. So I just want to be really clear. I'm not saying that because there's no truth to it. That's a very good question. When I asked her about it later, she didn't remember saying it. And my parents were very good role models for me. They were very active in the civil rights movement. I remember watching my father make fundraising calls during the Joanne Little case, if people remember that case. They were some of the first white donors to the Black Student Center on campus when, a lot of people were saying, why does there need to be a Black Student Center? There needs to be a white student center, stuff like that. So my parents were very good role models in that way. And they were also people, complicated people like everybody, who I think assumed that the goal was to include Black people, Indigenous people, people of color into the white world. And so there was and I remember bringing a Black teen home as my date, and my mother wasn't particularly happy about that. So there were all the contradictions of being white in a white supremacist culture that happened in my family. And I don't know what made it possible for my mother to do that. She was a very brave woman in so many ways. She grew up very poor in Texas. Her father put aside money for the boys to go to college, but not for the girls. So she made her way to social work school on her own. She made her way to New Orleans, where she met my father. She married him. He was a Jew. She became estranged from her family for marrying this Jewish man. And, she just lived this life that was not particularly meant for her. And I think it was hard. I think she had to battle a lot of demons, both internal and external. But she was, I thanked her for that. I'm very glad that I got to thank her for that gift, because it made a big difference in my life.
Thank you so much. Before I turn it back to Phyllis, I'll just say, if you have a chance, Tema, to look at the chat, there are some more questions in there, and I know people would love to hear from you.
I do. I will say that I think they put in the chat the link to, there's a website already that exists called dismantlingracism.org, where a lot of what I've just offered you is available to you. And then sometime, hopefully in the next month, the new website will be announced on that website, and you can link to that.
I've put it into the website, into the chat a couple of times.
Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tema. I think we've only just barely scratched the surface here of a conversation that we will be having many times over the next while. As you may know, there is a statewide committee, action team that's dealing with DEI, the DEI action team. And I want to thank the other members of that group for helping put together this webinar, and recognize them, please. As I mention your name, if you will just raise your hand a little bit and say hi, the Zoom program will find you so that all of us can see who you are. Mary Thompson, Wake County. Hi, Mary. Brenda Scherer, Henderson County. Is Brenda here? I did see her jump on. Pat McDaniels from ODC. And Jessica Goodman from Piedmont Triad is a member of this team, but she is not present today. And we have Marla Barthen from Lower Cape Fear, and I'm going to turn it over to Marla in just a moment. We would like to have representation in this group from all of the leagues throughout the state. So if you are interested in joining us in this statewide conversation, please let me know. My email is demko, DEMKO @lwvnc.org. And now let me ask Marla Barthen from Lower Cape Fear to talk about the next in this series of webinars on DEI. Marla?
Thank you. Yep, I'm good. Thank you, Phyllis. It was a really great program today. So our next program will be coming up in the fall. I look for that date to be announced. But we are looking to do an exploration of the 1898 coup d'etat that we had here in Wilmington. Our Lower Cape Fear chapter actually covers Brunswick, New Hanover, and Pender counties. So the coup d'etat really is in the groundwater here in Wilmington. And so we really want to take a deeper exploration of how that really affects our league in the past and how we move forward. And so we hope you all will tune in for that, because it's going to be a really great discussion and enlightening one. So we'll be glad to bring that to you.
Looking forward to that, Marla. Perhaps some of you have seen the new book out by David Zucchino, The Wilmington's Lie. There are a number of other books written on the 1898 massacre, speaking about what we learn about and don't learn about in school. I grew up in North Carolina and took North Carolina history and did not know about the Wilmington massacre until just a few years ago. And that has been just mind-boggling to me as to how kids in North Carolina don't really know our history. And this is even before the efforts that are now being made to suppress the truth in our history programs. I want to go back to Tema's presentation just a moment. She said that there would be a new website coming out. She's about to launch that. And I want to let you know that anyone who registered for this program will be receiving an email from us indicating the URL for that website. There will be just a wealth of information and follow on to this presentation. Now I'd like to ask two of our leagues, Piedmont Triad and Wake, to speak a little bit, just a few minutes, about their own DEI programs. And we will be putting into the chat the URL for getting to that website in Wake. I'm not sure about Piedmont Triad. If we've got anything there, we'll check on that. And how to register for those events, because they are available to anyone in the state in a league. Okay, I'm going to ask Gary Kenton from Piedmont Triad, and Gary has also recently joined the state board as a director. Gary?
Hi, all right. I believe, does Jen have the PowerPoint that I shared? I don't. There it comes. Perfect. All right. Let me just say, after hearing Tema, that Greensboro, a lot of people in Greensboro have gone through anti-racism training. The Racism Equity Institute is based here. They do training all over the country, but that's one answer, I think, to the question that was posed to Tema about what do we do, is an ongoing process. You don't become an anti-racist, you deal with it over and over again. So I've been through the training multiple times, and it's made a difference in Greensboro. Hundreds of people. At one point, every police officer was being made to go through the training. Every teacher was being made to go through this training. That stopped. We've taken a couple of steps backwards. But at any rate, Piedmont Triad League started a DEI, we started an anti-racism committee. And so we had this racial equity committee and we started looking at it. And Jen, if you'd move to the next slide, the first thing that we decide, well, you can see that it says that we talked about the DEI lens, that it's a way of looking at everything the league does, that we're going to examine every program we do, every event that we put on, and wonder, okay, how is this going to be perceived by different communities, different voices, different perspectives? And we will also look at what are the barriers that might exist that would prevent diversity, equity, and inclusivity. So that's the lens. All right, Jen, and you can move on. Thank you. All right. Tema said this earlier, but we came to that same conclusion that diversity and inclusion, those are existential problems for the league. We are aging out. Unless we find younger people and more people of color, the League of Women Voters is going to be done for. On the other hand, that is different from racial equity, different work. That's the conclusion we came to. So racial equity is not just a goal like attracting more younger members, more members of color, but a mindset that informs everything we do. And that includes the process of seeking greater diversity and inclusion. And I'm sure some of you have had similar experiences. We've reached out to people of color. We just recently had the NAACP asked the league to step up and talk about the upcoming elections. We've always had a little bit of a problem with NAACP because of our nonpartisanship. For the women, especially in NAACP, they don't get that. Nonpartisanship seems like another example of white privilege to them. They can't afford nonpartisanship. They have to go with who's ever on their side, which right now is the Democratic Party. So that looks like white privilege to them. So it looks very different, nonpartisanship to the league. So that's a real thing that has to be dealt with as we're trying to get more inclusivity. And Jen, if you'd move on, I think there's one more maybe. All right, so we tried to come up with a working definition of racism. And as I said, I forgot this was in the slide, that many of us in the league and throughout Greensboro have been through the anti-racism training. I recommend it highly. They have a 1-day version of the training and a 2.5-day version of the training. The definition that we have found useful, and it came to us from the Racial Equity Institute and the People's Institute from New Orleans, is that racism equals bias on the basis of color plus power. And that can be a controversial definition because what it says is that Black people cannot be racist because they do not have the power to enforce their racism. So that definition is not correct, can be argued against, is problematic, but we found it useful to use because it reminds white people that we have that power. Because we have that power to enforce our view of the world, that is the definition of racism. And also leads you into a discussion about systemic racism. Going back to what Tema was talking about, that are white people inherently racist? No, but we participate in systems that are racist. So if you participate in the electoral system, if you participate in the health system, if you participate in the medical, any education system, all the disparities are striking. If you participate in those systems, then you bear some of the responsibility for the racist outcomes of those systems. And Jenna, is that it? Is that, I believe, okay. All right, so we end up with a couple of questions we hope are helpful. All right, who's involved in the process? If you're doing a program or you're trying to get whatever you're doing with the league, who's involved, are key stakeholders meaningfully included? Is this work that will impact a particular group or community? If so, is their voice represented? And then how diverse is the group of decision makers? Is it diverse enough? Anyway, that's, I think that was the last slide. Is that right, Jen?
There's one more, this last one.
Okay. All right. All right, I think I spoke to that one. Is there another one?
That's it.
That's it. Okay, great. All right. So I guess I'll defer to Phyllis. I'm happy to answer questions, but you probably want to do the other presentation. And then
I think we'll move to the Wake County League presentation, and then if there's time, we'll have questions at the end, because I know people are pressing their dinner time. Shannon Halber from Wake County League is with the DEI committee, and you have some slides, I believe. Is that right? Shannon, have you unmuted yourself?
Okay, yes, we have slides, I believe.
Mhm.
Yes. Yes, there we are. Okay. So, hello, my name is Shannon Halber, and with Weta Watson, I am a co-chair of the League of Women Voters for Wake County DEI committee. And the purpose of our committee is to provide a safe space for our members to learn about diversity, equity, and inclusion in our lives, and more importantly, in our work with the League. We want to develop habits to consider DEI in all our planning for all of our events. We want to look through the lens of DEI for everything we do. And so how do we do this? Next slide, please. So we started with brainstorming conversations, doing research, and finally deciding on topics. As I stated before, we wanted to create a safe space for our members to learn and discuss topics, and topics that for many of us, we had no personal experience with, but other members have had these experiences for a lifetime. So these are the topics that we have used for our first go around for the DEI roundtable from August through July. And the danger of the single story, we've discussed housing discrimination, intersectionality, defining defunding the police, white privilege, understanding the Black Lives Matter movement. This May, on May 25th, we are going to be having a roundtable on microaggressions. The topic for June is gun violence and how it intersects with racism. And our final roundtable will be talking about, where is it? Are we still a democracy? And that's going to be our final topic for this session. Next slide, please. Okay. So I'm so sorry. Yeah. Okay. So what we chose for our format was the roundtable. And this is our run of show for our roundtables, so you can see how we do it. We start with a slide deck of 4 basic slides that never change, explaining what we're doing. Our first slide was the slide that we showed originally on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And for example, diversity is that you're invited to the party. Equity, they're playing your music at the party. And inclusion would be you get to be asked to dance at the party. Our next slide are the objectives for our roundtables. And the first one is we wanted to provide league members with opportunities to examine our own biases. We want to promote a league that better represents the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we want to use the principles of DEI. Whoops, I'm sorry, I'm in a little trouble. We want to use the principles of DEI to develop more effective strategies to affect the change in our community. Our third slide is just the general ground rules. We want to be open to recognize and acknowledge our own biases. We want to be civil to each other at all times. We want to accept constructive feedback.
Can you show what he's eating?
I'm sorry? I'm sorry?
Oh, people need to go on mute. That's all. Go on.
Okay. We want to recognize and acknowledge our own biases. We want to be civil at all times to each other. We want to be accepting of constructive feedback from other members. We want to avoid interrupting each other. We want to give everybody the chance to speak and participate, but we never call on other members. We let everybody participate on their own terms. And our fourth slide is just regular Zoom rules. We want to mute when we're not speaking. We want to use the chat features for questions. We raise the hand icon when we want to speak. And we post at the end, we post a commitment to action, and we post additional resources on the chat. Okay, so after the slide, then we have a review of homework. And homework is an affectionate term that we use for preparation work. And we review the homework because a lot of times members don't have time to prepare, and we want to make sure everybody has at least a foundation of the topic that we're discussing. After we review the homework, we enter poll questions, usually 2 poll questions on chat. And that gets everybody thinking about how the topic affects them personally. And for example, one of the poll questions for the upcoming roundtable on microaggressions will be, before reviewing the resources for today's discussion, were you aware of microaggressions? And I myself was not aware of the term or really what they were. After we have the 2 poll questions answered and discuss them a little bit, we have a 5-minute video, 2 to 5 minute video that gives, usually it's very informative, and it kind of sums up in a very succinct sort of way the topic that we're discussing. And that also helps members who have come without preparation. After the video, we break out into breakout groups, usually 4 to 5 members in a breakout group with a facilitator. We have 3 breakout questions, and we discuss for 35 minutes these 3 breakout questions. Sometimes you'll only get 1 breakout question discussed in 35 minutes. Sometimes you can discuss all 3, depends on the passion of the people in your breakout group. And an example of a breakout question for the upcoming roundtable will be, what is an example of a microaggression you have witnessed? At the end of the 35 minutes, we wrap it up. We come together in a wrap-up session. We have members post a personal call to action on the chat. An example of that would be call a senator. I'm going to write a letter to the editor. I'm going to read a book. I'm going to be aware of microaggressions when I hear them now. We ask for additional resources that people may bring to the table themselves from their own experiences and research. And then we discuss future wake events. Okay, and next slide. Okay, so where are we now? The more we discussed, the more we found out how much we didn't know, and the more we realized there are so many topics to be covered. So for round 2, we are considering these topics for discussion: gentrification, truth and reconciliation, redistricting, medical apartheid, environmental justice, LGBTQ and transgender issues, and gun violence. The gun violence topic for this June is going to be the intersectionality between racism and gun violence, but we also know that women are impacted by gun violence, LGBTQ communities are impacted by gun violence, and transgender communities are impacted by gun violence, and that's why that is still kept there. So if you want to see us in action, please join us for our roundtable on the topic of microaggressions on May 25th. And I believe Mary is going to put that link in the chat.
I've put it in the chat.
Thank you. And I'm going to put my email in the chat. So if you have any questions or just want to find out more about what we're doing in Wake County for our DEI, please just send me an email. And I would ask Tema, if she's still here, I would love to hear what ideas you have for ways we can improve how we're doing our DEI.
She had to leave for another
Oh,
event.
she had to leave. Oh, okay. I thought her observations about DEI were enlightening, so I would be interested in that. All right, so that is DEI for Wake County.
Thank you, Shannon, and thank you, Gary.
You're welcome.
We are running out of time, actually. I haven't seen any questions in the chat, but I hope that you will get back to either or both of these people if you're interested in knowing more about their programs. And of course, get that URL and sign up for things that Wake League is doing in this area. Let me make sure there's nothing out here. There's a comment from Barbara Carter to everyone and mentioning the Wilmington matter, which we're going to hear about more in the fall.
That was really for Marla. I couldn't find her name.
Yeah. Tema did have to leave. I would like to explore with her further the terminology that we used. I've been very uncomfortable with DEI as a moniker for what we do. She mentioned the term transformation. I like to explore that with her some more. And if you have some ideas about this, then come and join us on the DEI statewide committee so that we can talk about this issue. What we do, how we define ourselves really relates to what we do. It's an overall philosophy. And if the word inclusion is a problem for us, then we need to figure that out and think about some other terminology. This has been quite fun and welcome to see all of you people, and hope that you'll continue to join us for these webinars as we proceed through the fall. As I mentioned, and Marla mentioned, Lower Cape Fear will be hosting the program in the fall, probably September, October area. And we're going to close with playing the song again that you heard or may have heard at the beginning, called Everything to Gain. I actually got this from a great program that I saw last week, which Tema herself had done. And I'm sharing the lyrics with you in the chat if you want to read them along with hearing the song. I will do so in a moment. I think that's it. The name of the song is Everything to Gain, and we do in fact have everything to gain by working together on this important issue. Thank you all for coming. I hope you have a good evening.
Thank you.
I think, Jen, can you play the song again?
I was.
When you can breathe, I can breathe. When you win, I win. When you're fed, I'm fed. We have everything to gain. When you're here, you're safe, I'm safe. When you're free, I'm free. When you can breathe, I can breathe. When you win, I win. When you feel respect, I feel respect. We have everything to gain. When you're healed, I'm healed. When you're whole, I'm whole. When you're safe, I'm safe. When you're free,